The previous tenet we had discussed was that one only prays to God, one prays no one else but God himself. And we spoke at length why. Now that we believe there's a God, now that we understand that the world did not come about randomly, but it was by divine design, and everything in existence is for a purpose with an objective. But if not, God never communicated his objective, his intent, how are we supposed to figure it out? As I mentioned, it's easy to find a needle in a desert than figuring that out. What exactly is the objective of creation? Unless God tells us and communicates to mankind or some representatives of humanity what exactly his intention was or what the objective is, how are we supposed to know? So logically speaking, without accepting this tenet, just logically speaking, if factually there is a creator and the creator had an objective and a purpose to create, evidently he would communicate this to someone, to a sect or group of people. And they, having that special value in the eyes of humanity, they will transmit this to the rest of humanity to give them an understanding what exactly is the value, the purpose of creation, just logically speaking. We find in the Torah the three classifications of obligation. They're chukim, statutes, they're mishpatim, these are rational laws, and there's edus, the mitzvos, they're commandments, which are a testament or to commemorate certain events of the past. What are mishpatim? What are laws? Laws are rational laws. And the commentators explained, even if the Torah wouldn't have stated them explicitly, we'd understand ourselves as logical, intelligent beings that certain things are not able to be unless certain things are in place. For instance, if people don't respect one another's rights of existence, you cannot have a society. You can't have a world. There's a concept of ownership. There's a concept of damages. There's a concept known, you can't take something that's not rightfully yours. There's certain fundamentals of existence that if you're going to have a society, you have more than one or two people to maintain that society to continue, you must logically promulgate, legislate laws, and there has to be a certain basic ethical, moral code for humanity. Otherwise, the world can't continue. The world will continuously destruct, and you're starting over again continuously. So that's mishpatim. Mishpatim means something which is a rational, logical law that even if God would have given it, even if it would not be divine, mankind would have so-called figured it out on his own. It's like today. Laws, secular laws, where do they emanate from? Where did they start? There were a group of people who were very intelligent, who understood what life's all about, and they understood if you want to have a society, unless there are laws in place, and unless people are going to be prosecuted, if they violate those laws and they break those laws, you can't have a society. That's called chaos. It's called mayhem. You cannot have a society. Meaning mankind must abide by certain code. And then we can be productive, we go forward. Otherwise, we self-destruct. Anarchy. The Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos that we should pray for the welfare of a government, because if not for welfare of government, man would swallow one another alive. That would be the extreme level of anarchy. And when there's anarchy, everybody goes into a survival mode. And therefore, when you're in survival mode, it's total destruction. People literally will justify swallowing others alive for the sake of survival. So therefore, there has to be laws, and the laws have to be actually implemented For instance, we have 7 Noahide laws. One of the laws of the Noahide laws is laws creating a judicial system. That's one of the 7 Noahide laws. The others, it could say, we would have gone, stealing is one of the Noahide laws. A human being is not permitted to steal, Jew and non-Jew alike. A Jew and non-Jew alike is not permitted to commit murder. That's a rational law. But if you're not permitted to do that, and there is no system or body of people to actually rein in on this and prosecute the violators, what's the value of the law? The law has no value. If you have a law and the law cannot be, actually people are not prosecuted for breaking the law, what's the value of a law? So it's logical, understandable, and cogent and compelling, you must have a judicial system. Without a judicial system, nothing means anything. It's just words. It's, as we say, it's law on the books. But if it's not implemented and people will not be prosecuted, it means nothing. This tenet, shekol divri dvim emes, that the words of the prophets are true. We have to discuss what a prophet is. But a person who's proven himself to be a prophet is a person who speaks the name of God, that God had spoken to him to communicate to mankind a fundamental, whether it's an ethic, a moral, a principle, whatever it may be. The words of prophets are true. Person says, I don't believe in prophecy. It doesn't make sense. That man, God, the creator, should speak to a human being. The words of prophet are true. And the prophet himself, of course, has to prove himself to be a prophet, because otherwise anyone could claim that God spoke to him. You know, I had a dream. And God spoke to me in the dream, therefore what? Means nothing. How do you prove that? If that dream has relevance to me, I want to know, how do I know? I have to be convinced that God spoke to you. Irrefutably convinced. And if I'm not irrefutably convinced, as gullible as people may be, many people are gullible. They don't need much convincing. They're impressed with very little. But that's not enough to establish a prophet to be a prophet. There's certain evidence, irrefutable evidence, which establishes a prophet to be a prophet, as we can discuss. But the concept that the words of prophets are true, before we determine what a prophet is, that has to be a fact and something which has to be, because otherwise, how do we understand the value and the objective of life and existence? I believe with absolute truth that all the words of the prophets or emes are true. Until Sinai, if a prophet had a prophecy, he, being the recipient of that transmission from God, knows that God spoke to him. But anyone other than that person himself, who was the one who received that transmission from God, how does that person know that God speaks to people, or that person was spoken to? How does one know that? So he has to convince others based on his own experience that he did have that experience. So either you're convinced, you're convinced. You're not convinced, you're not convinced. So until Sinai, as we'll discuss in a moment, only the prophet himself knew that he was the recipient of that transmission. I'll give you an example. We read about Avram Avinu, the founding father of the Jewish people. God comes to him and he says to him, take your son who you love, who was born to you in your old age, at the age of 100. Bring him up as a burnt offering. Avram Avinu was espousing monotheism, and he gave his life for that principle and that belief. And he took on the world single-handedly. He was willing to die for that belief, for that principle. As he went into the kiln, miraculously came out of the kiln. He fought the four mightiest kings and he was victorious over them. He was proclaimed as what? As the Prince of God by the world. But how did they really know that he was the recipient of a transmission of God, of the Creator, that he claims that the world is controlled and dictated and willed by one being? The answer is because he was convincing. He convinced the world based on what? Dialogue, intellect, proofs. But as convincing as a person is, nothing is foolproof unless it's proven irrefutably to be absolute. Now, how do you prove anything to be absolute? The human intellect is not absolute. There's certain areas which we may be convinced, and then we realize, as certain as we were that whatever that was to be definite, with a slight passing of time, we realize we find there's certain flaws in the logic. Rambam writes in the laws of idolatry, there's a negative commandment that a Jew is not permitted to turn to idolatry or to idols. What does this mean? So it means what it says, but it's a lot more than that. Rambam writes, Maimonides writes, that if a person's belief is not rooted in the transmission of Sinai, which is fact, and it's only because he claims there's nothing more cogent, more logical, and more truthful than Judaism, he says, you're a violation. Do not veer after idolatry. Why? Because he says, as broad-minded as a person may be, as profound his intellect may be, but we know that daitum shalodin katsoro, man logically, intellectually has limitation. And he says, what we believe to be true today, tomorrow, we realize it wasn't as true as we convinced the day before. So if something is not rooted in fact, irrefutable fact, you're standing on thin ice. It's unquestionable. How long will it endure? Give you an example. This is a real life example. You have two people committed to one another. Their friendship is like the Rock of Gibraltar, immovable, cannot in any way be negatively affected. And they entered into a covenant that will die for one another. And they've proven over years how committed they are to one another, and how selflessly they will do for one another. Then there's one incident, which one person feels he was betrayed by the other, or he was disappointed seriously by the other. All that love, all that feeling, all that level of commitment, in a second, dissipates, and it's almost as if it didn't exist. And the person has a whole different perception. Maybe all these years that you were convincing that you were behind me and backing me and selflessly committed to me, it was all a ploy, ultimately, to betray me. That's the way the human mind works. So we're convinced of something one moment. You just need one event in life, or even no event, personally, something you observe, and because of that, it touches you in a certain way, and what was yesterday as if it wasn't. It's refuted. There's certain things, as things evolve, whether it's in science, medicine, there were certain formulas or procedures that were in place, and it was believed to be there was no other way. and all of a sudden they realized that they overlooked a tiny little piece of information. They came upon something else and they realized that it was incorrect. And not only is it not beneficial to humanity, it's detrimental to humanity. I always give the example. At one time when society and the medical community and nutrition believed what was healthy, today they say, if you want to have clogged arteries, when people die by the age of 50 of a heart attack, and the person didn't live longer, so people believe that to be the reality. But once people start to live longer and they realize why people didn't live longer, then they realize the original basis of health and nutrition was flawed. And they changed the whole structure of what nutrition and health is. And that's why we have longevity. So until Sinai, how did a prophet know that he was a prophet? He knew he was a prophet. Why? Because God communicated to him. And that experience, as Ramchal writes, even for a moment, that human being is a changed human being. When God comes upon a person and connects with him, connects with his soul and transmits whatever that transmission may be, he becomes forever a different human being. But that's him. So Avram is told, bring your son as a burnt offering. So Avram hears that. Irrefutably, he knows that. Avram has been espousing all his life that human sacrifice is forbidden. It's murder. God, the creator, the monotheistic being, the omnipotent being, says it's murder. You're not permitted to do it. And he himself is told by God, bring your son as a sacrifice. So what he's been espousing and preaching and convincing humanity that it's something which is unacceptable and unforgivable. Only God has a right to take a life. A human being cannot, regardless of what your intent is. And he goes and takes the son who's born to him miraculously in his old age, and he brings him as a sacrifice. That's number one. What does the world have to say about this? What about Yitzchak? Yitzchak, God didn't tell Yitzchak, his son, Isaac, that he should be brought as a burnt offering. His father is sharing with him what God had communicated to him. Now, how's Yitzchak supposed to believe where all his life, from the moment he was born till the present day, he was 37 years old, he wasn't a child, and he wasn't a person who was gullible. His father goes and says, by the way, we're taking a trip, 3-day hike, trek, up a mountain, and then he asks a few questions, and Yitzchak realizes that if they don't have a sheep to bring as a sacrifice, he's going to be the sacrifice. And he allows himself to be bound hand and foot on that altar and to be slaughtered. But God didn't communicate to Yitzchak to tell him, you're meant to be the burnt offering. That's my will. Although he believed in a God. But how does he believe that God had said to his father something which all along, according to the Noahide laws, is a violation of Noahide laws? Well, because this is the exception, because God said differently. But how do I know God said differently? Because Avram received this communication, this transmission. But Yitzchak didn't receive this transmission. He doesn't know. So why did he agree to be taken as the sacrifice, and willingly? If you read the Midrash, to what degree he was willing. He wanted to be bound hand and foot because he may flinch, and when he flinches, it may create a blemish, and the actually ritual slaughter may not be valid, or accidentally, as he has the reflex, he may hit his father and will violate the law of not honoring the father properly. These are the precautions he, as the object of sacrifice, believed it to that degree. How did he believe it? The answer is, the only reason why Yitzchak was Yitzchak wasn't an ordinary person. And he understood things which 99.99% of humanity did not understand because of his own dimension of spirituality, although he wasn't a prophet at this time. But he understood that nothing exists in existence as his father, and he understood, based on his credibility, on his track record, going in the kiln, coming out of the kiln, defeating the four mightiest kings. Avram had a track record. You may attribute that track record to witchcraft, to sorcery, to whatever you may attribute to, but that's not seeing it correctly. Yitzhak processed it, internalized it, and was convinced beyond any doubt that his father is a prophet of God, and therefore anything his father communicates to him is the word of God. He's convinced without a question. Therefore, when his father tells him, God came to me and said, I should take my beloved son who was born to me in my old age and bring him up as a burnt offering, Yitzhak did not hesitate and agreed to be taken as that sacrifice, to be the object of that sacrifice. But that's Yitzhak. What about humanity? Humanity, you say maybe, they're gullible. As convinced as they are, they're not maybe really that convinced. For instance, in our society today, you say to people, do you believe in God? People who are educated, people who are part of the financial community, the intellectual community, and you ask them, going back 50 years ago, a person who did not believe in God wasn't considered part of society, part of a functioning society that was considered the civilized society. You had to be a bohemian. You had to be you were different. You were not part of the society. The average person who was civilized, part of society, and valued societal values, believed in God. Today, you ask people, many people say they don't believe in God. Or they'll say, I do, but at times I question. It's not unusual. That's our society today. Because nothing is accepted face value. Why? Because things change so quickly. What was fact a day ago, what was on the in a day ago today becomes obsolete. There's such movement in our lifetime that we can't believe that so many things have happened over the past 30 years, which in one time it would take centuries to happen. That's how quickly things change. So what was may not be. And what is today, I may be convinced differently tomorrow. So a person says, basically, I believe in God. But the times I question. At one time, a person believed God would never say such a thing. Then he questions. He may say, I don't have an answer, but he never questions whether there's a God or not. What is God's intention? Because the core of humanity, civilized humanity, was that there is a monotheistic being and there is a creator. And of course, we have blind spots, and that's why we do wrong things. And we don't have all the answers, but basically, humanity belief was that there is a monotheistic being. And that's why on the American currency, it says, in God we trust. God bless America. What it means today, it's just a slogan, God bless America. And that's about it. But at one time, it was the core, the fabric of civilized society, American society, and the patriotism was rooted in that. Even the concept of all men are created equal, that statement, created equal, what did it created? Big Bang. It's not called created, no. That is rooted, all men are created equal because there is a divine being who created existence. All men are created equal, whatever that means. Created equal to be equal opportunity. No human being has a right to lord over anyone else. That's created equal. But that was the fabric, and that was the foundation of the American dream. It was based on that. That was the foundation. So we believe things. Yitzchak, because of his dimension of person, he believed because of what he saw, who his father was, in his mind, there's no question. He is a recipient of God's communication. He himself personally is not on that level. To have the capacity or the worthiness that God should communicate with him. Only later, when God did communicate with him, that was a confirmation to what he believed without a question in terms of what his father was. But versus humanity, how is humanity supposed to believe that Avram's the prophet? You know, there's an expression, might is right. That's it. There's an expression, a Jewish expression. The man who has the 100 has the opinion which is the convincing position. When you have that holy buck in your pocket and you have enough of it, society worships you. People will not dare to question, because who could question success? And today, it's not so simple. At one time, a medical doctor in the United States was the closest thing to God. A patient wouldn't dare question what a doctor, if he had an opinion and made a decision, and if you would even question it, firstly, he'd dismiss you as a patient. And not only that, he would look at you with such a level of shock, like you're almost like subhuman. Who are you to even question me? I'm going back now. When I was born, my mother told me, doctors in those days, their word was sacred, and they were pompous, and they were arrogant. And if he walked around with his little black bag, and he went to medical school, and he had his black Cadillac, although it didn't have, he drove it himself without a chauffeur. This was the ultimate. That was the ultimate. Although he didn't have more money than the richest people in society, but that didn't make a difference. He represented something which was sacred. And he was the closest thing to God, and he behaved like he was the closest thing to God. Today, you can't be the closest thing to God because people even question whether there is a God. So there's no closest thing to God. But again, there has to be prophets. The words of the prophets are true. Because how could we have an existence where it's so vast, it borders on the infinite, and the more we understand, the more we realize we don't understand? How could God create such an existence and not share with us and give us an understanding of what it's all about and what the purpose of all this is? Therefore, the words of prophets have to be true. As I said, how are we convinced that there's a prophet? Most people are not Yitzchak. But although they're not Yitzchak, it doesn't take much convincing to convince society that something should be what it is. If a person accepts things which he shouldn't accept because they're gullible due to their own inadequacies, and they worship things which should not be worshipped, and they gravitate to things which they should not gravitate to. So, and the prophet, who's so-called the holy prophet, unless he puts the fear of God into that person, the man is not moving. Could you imagine if a person today would walk on water? He'd be the talk of society, holy man. And if he did something which he caused an earthquake and 100,000 people were killed, and he says, I speak in the name of God, do you think anybody would question who he is? Definitely not. But it's not simple. If you're a Jew, you don't believe he's a prophet. Because within the realm of sorcery could mimic prophecy. And through sorcery, you could bring back, as we see in Egypt, they were able to turn water into blood. They're able to do many things which they could manipulate the forces of existence to bring about certain results. They could cause people to die. They do many things. They could split water. They can move mountains through witchcraft. So as a Jew, to be a prophet, he has to present certain level of credentials. And if he doesn't prove those credentials, present them, he's not a prophet. And what do we attribute to? Something other than God. What it is, we don't know. There are other forces in existence which allow things to happen. Firstly, most people have misconception what a prophet is. Most people believe a prophet is a man who tells the future. God shares with him the future. That's not what a prophet is. The word prophet means he's a person who God communicates with. And whatever that communication is irrelevant. He may communicate a message. He may communicate something on a personal level just which has relevance to the prophet himself. He may communicate something which has to do with the future. There are many levels of communication. But prophet does not mean one who foretells the future or knows the future because God told him the future. A prophet only means a person who's qualified, who has a capacity that God communicates to him. That's all it means. Now, who is qualified or has the capacity that he is worthy that God should communicate with him? You could have, we speak about, the Talmud speaks about there are 36 hidden tzaddikim in the world. 36 devoutly righteous people that the world stands in the merit. We don't even know who they are. So you could have a person who looks like a vagabond. He looks like an ordinary factory worker, and he could be one of those 36 special, holy, devout people that the world stands in their merit. So what is a prophet? Someone who looks holier than thou. A prophet doesn't, it has nothing to do with what he looks like. It's what he is. Now, how do we know what he is? He has to prove it. And the Torah tells us there's a way to prove it. But until Sinai, every prophecy was in the sleep state, not in the wake state. At Sinai, they calculated the numbers. The Torah tells us there were 600,000 males above the age of 20 left Egypt. Those males, the presumption is they had wives. They had children. So if you figure out just the numbers, there must have been 3-4 million people at Sinai, at Mount Sinai, when God openly communicated to every one of them. How do we know this? Because that's the narrative in the Torah, which we'll discuss in a moment. So God openly spoke to every one of those Jews who stood at Sinai. And the Torah tells us they stood, they saw, and they heard. That means no one was deaf, no one was lame, and no one was blind. So whatever physical handicaps that existed at that moment, at Sinai, miraculously they recovered. The one who couldn't see was able to see. The one who was not able to hear was able to hear. And the one who was not able to stand was able to stand. Because that's the Torah says. All people, Jews at Sinai, they stood, they saw, and they heard. Well, if this is a direct, open communication with God, and he's taking us to be his Jewish people, if God created a world, he could cause a person who's blind to see, a person who's deaf to hear, and a person who's lame to be able to stand. That's what happened. The communication at Sinai was in a wake state, not in a sleep state. Not in a sleep state, which we'll discuss in a moment. But even if it was in a sleep state, every Jew, God communicated at Sinai when they were in this trance-like state. When each person awakens and comes back, and you ask them, what happened? And they all have the exact same communication. And each one says, God communicated and said, and he says verbatim the 10 Commandments. So every person knows. Every person at Sinai knows that God communicates with humanity. Every Jew that was there. Every Jew that was there not only communicated in a sleep state, he was in the wake state. Why did he have to communicate? Why did they experience this in a wake state? This is the only time in the history of existence, other than Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was the only prophet who prophesied in the wake state, not in the sleep state. But at Sinai, every Jew who was taken as God's people, who had that same pedigree, they prophesied in the wake state. Why was Moshe able to prophesy in the wake state and no other prophet was able to prophesy in the wake state? What is the reason for this? Firstly, when God communicates with a human being, it's with the soul, not through the faculties, the human faculties, the brain, or any part of the body. The soul itself is a spiritual component of the human being. And its capacity, because it's not physical, it's not finite, it has an unlimited capacity. So if the infinite being communicates with the human being, what aspect, what part of the human being does it communicate with? With the spiritual component, which is the soul, which is not finite, which is not material, which is not earthy. And therefore, as I mentioned, what a person experiences in the prophecy, even for a nanosecond, the amount of information that God could communicate at that moment could take 100 years to accumulate that amount of information. And because it's communicated to the soul, it's so emblazoned in his being that there's no human experience which is the equivalent of that experience. And the level of clarity, because physical automatically blurs things. We're not able to fully grasp, as I say, we see something. To really be appreciated very often something we see, you have to reflect upon it. And the more you reflect, you will see it more in the positive, if it is positive, or you reflect on it, if it's a negative, the more you appreciate how negative it is. It's not something where immediately we may be touched to a degree, but to have a grasp and appreciation for its value and be a beneficiary of that, it takes an extended period of time. And even after everything's said and done, one still doesn't fully absorb whatever that is. Prophecy, it's straight to the soul. There are no barriers. And every prophet, Ramchal writes that when God connects to a human being who's worthy and qualified to be a prophet, at that moment, he should really die. Because a prophet, before he prophesizes, he's in a wake state and he starts convulsing. Because when God comes upon him, the human body does not have the capacity to be able to experience that experience, and therefore he starts convulsing and he goes unconscious. And then in the unconscious state, God communicates with the soul. Could you imagine a person having 1,000,000 watts going through his body? The person would convulse, would be incinerated. He turned to ash. God coming in contact with the human being, it's the equivalent of that and more. And therefore, Ramchal writes, the prophet, when he prophesizes, God puts him on life support. That while he's communicating with his soul, he's willing that despite the experience, his physicality should remain intact and he should not expire. It's too much. It's not possible. That's because his physicality is physical and his soul is spiritual. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, his physicality was spiritualized to the degree that it was almost on par with his soul. Therefore, there was no barrier. His physicality was not a barrier to that communication, and he had the capacity to communicate in a wake state, which no other human being had that, regardless of how holy he was and how devout he was, because Moshe, in terms of his negation to God, was fully negated. As he said, what am I? There was not a trace of self. Every other human being other than Moshe, whatever that trace was, is a bit infinitesimal, but it is. Once there's that barrier. Moshe didn't have any barriers. There was no barriers between him and God. Therefore, when God communicated with him, his physicality was on par with the soul. At Sinai, so every Jew should be able to believe that Moshe's prophecy was the wake state. Miraculously, God allowed that every Jew who witnessed God speaking to Moshe, that they were experiencing that prophecy in a wake state for that reason. Of course, it had to be confirmed for all eternity, irrefutably, that Moshe is God's spokesman. So therefore, they had to witness it in a wake state, and therefore the communication of them was in the wake state. But that's the first time publicly God displayed his communication with a human being. So from then going forward, the 4 million people knew irrefutably that God communicates with man, because every Jew who was at Sinai, who became a Jew at Sinai, that's when this metamorphosis took place. We went from Noahide to become a Jewish people, God's people. They realized that the word realize is not a word, is an understatement. They experienced that reality that God does communicate with men, with mankind, and every one of them was a prophet. The Jews at Sinai, not at Sinai, at the splitting of the sea, it says God's presence was so palpable that they were able to point with a finger when they said, "This is my God, and I will exalt him." And Chazal tell us, the Midrash tells us, that what the maidservant witnessed at the sea, Yechezkel, the prophet, who was one of the greatest prophets, did not witness. So the experience at the sea, although it was not an experience in a wake state, but it touched upon, they were touched by God's presence in the way where God is irrefutably a reality. They saw God's majesty at the splitting of the sea, which Yechezkel never saw God's majesty. That's what they saw. But why is it a fundamental that God communicates that the words of prophets are the truth? Because if God never communicated with mankind, then existence has no value whatsoever. The objective of God's creation has no value. It's like creating an unintelligent being and just roam the forest, or forage the forest, means nothing. Because if God had a purpose and an objective, and he never shared that objective, because God doesn't communicate with man, meaning there are no prophets, if that's the case, you're actually denying all the tenets that preceded this tenet, that the words of prophets are true. Years ago, I read an article. There was a famous atheist who lived in San Francisco, and they asked him, what's going to be after 100, whatever, so many years after you die, you meet God, what are you going to say? You're going to be in shock. Well, what are you going to say? He said, God, why don't you let me know that you were there? That's what he said. You understand? It's not so simple. There are factually enough signposts that God is here. You have to notice it. And that's the challenge of life. But usually the challenge of these people, their egos are so big, they're not able to accept certain things which are accepted as tenets of society, of civilization, because if they do, automatically, that means they're subject to the dictates of whoever that may be. And they want to just be free. They want to be independent. It's what I see, what I understand. And that's it. Therefore, these people just shut the door in the face of light, of truth, but they're truthful. A person could be the greatest physicist who ever lived, the greatest mind, has nothing to do with anything. Because accepting God means you have to subordinate yourself. You're bound to something that you didn't create yourself. People create certain values, and it's their values. That's the called subordinate yourself. That's me, that's I. Accepting God means it's irrelevant who I am, it's what he wants. That's accepting God. You have to humble yourself. You have to negate yourself to some degree. These people say, unless I'm convinced beyond any doubt, until it's that point, I don't accept. Why not? For whatever reason. The person has an ego issue. It's the I and the me and nobody but me. But if that's the case, God's objective of existence is recognizing him and living for his glory, which is the value of this challenge of existence. This person will never meet unless you believe the words of prophets are true. Years ago, there were many things bantered around. They would give certain types of allegories to distinguish and discern Lavdil El of Havdolas between Judaism and every other religion in existence. What is the difference between Judaism and any other religion? When I say Judaism, I mean Judaism which was transmitted from Sinai. Not Judaism, which is progressive, and it's the ethics and morals. And the Jew being a light unto nations, they're going to teach the nations what ethics and morals are. I'm talking about Judaism, which is the immutable doctrine that God gave us at Sinai 3,600 years ago, and it's etched in stone, and it cannot be changed. Cannot be altered, cannot be modified. The principles are intact, are in place. Nothing has changed in all these years. And those principles are applicable to all advances in society. Now, what's the difference? They used to tell the story, in Hasidic sects, the rabbi, he's the equivalent of the prince. And the Hasidim, the followers, they don't worship the rabbi, but they want to do whatever they can to assist the rabbi to succeed in his dissemination of teachings, and they will provide whatever's needed that the rabbi should function fully in his capacity as the leading rabbi of that sect. And many of them, they live like princes. Financially, he's provided for, he's respected, he's revered, and he has his teachings and he has his approaches, which is fine. But very often when a problem happens, you have a man, very holy rabbi, and he is a holy rabbi, and he has two sons. And each son is also very gifted, very unusual in a positive. And suddenly passes away, and he did not leave a last will and testament who his successor should be. And each one is talented, each one is gifted, but the father did not choose a successor. He passed away suddenly. And among the Hasidim, you have thousands of followers. Some say Chaim should be the new rabbi, chief rabbi, holy Hasidic leader. Others say Shlomo should be the one, not Chaim. And each one tries to convince the others why his choice is a better choice. and they reach a stalemate. They can't decide who should be the successor of the father, because each of the sons have phenomenal qualifications. So one of the sons had a phenomenal idea, a brainstorm, how he's going to become the new rabbi, the new holy leader. He calls an emergency session of all the leaders of the followers, and he says, I'm going to tell you something now you won't believe. My father came to me in a dream and said to me, I should be his successor. They all get excited. Long live the new rabbi. Did you hear? Chaim had this dream. His father came to him with a dream and said he should be his successor. But there was some well-weathered Hasidim who were very wise. They said, but we want to ask you a question. If your father wanted you to be his successor, why did he come to you? Why did he come to us? He should have come to us to tell us that you should be a successor. Why did he come to you? And that's the difference, lahavdil, between Judaism and any other religion. Any other religion, you had a handful of people who convinced the masses a person is a deity, or a person deifies himself and convinces people that he has divine powers. Judaism, every Jew that existed on the face of this planet stood at Sinai. God himself, the creator himself, communicated with every one of us. And not only every one of us in the physical existence, every future soul that would ever be born into existence was present at Sinai when he took us as his people. So although we have no recollection, because we were in a spiritual state, but the 4 million people were there, openly prophesied, and had an experience where there's nothing comparable to that in existence. Irrefutably, God came to us, and we know this factually, that God is the creator and all things about that we have to know about God and the objectives of creation. These 4 million people are not selling about a bill of goods. And there's an obligation. They must teach their children what they experienced, what they witnessed. And every generation has to pass on that tradition, which started 3,600 years ago. That's Judaism. There's no other religion in existence which has any relevance or semblance of the cogency and truth, absoluteness of what Judaism is. That's what we're all about. A person says, but why can't it be different? Why do the laws of kashrus, dietary laws? Today we're so advanced, we're able to cure the meats in a way we'd have to be concerned about disease. What do you have to extract the blood? What do you have to do this? What do you have to do that? We received it from the source. God says that's the way it's done, that's the way it's done. You know, you have certain principles of physics. Those principles are ironclad. And if you go do it differently, existence doesn't function because it's just the reality of existence. Why is the earth is flammable and other things are not flammable? Because that's the way it is. But why? Why, when I walk through fire, why don't I get burnt? If Avram wasn't consumed and incinerated when he went to the kiln, why would I go into the kiln? Why will I be incinerated? Why? Is that a question? Because God wanted Avram to come out of the kiln, and God says, fire consumes, incinerates, burns. That's the difference. If God said you must observe dietary laws, and it's immutable, because based on the construct of your soul, the spiritual construct, you must abide, otherwise it creates a deficiency in your soul. And you must do this because it advances your soul. But why? You're asking the Creator why. The Creator created you. If you can't understand the Einstein's theory of relativity, because you don't have your capacity is not large enough or broad enough and deep enough, you expect to understand the divine mind. Why? The answer is because it's in your best interest. One is a detriment. The other one is the ultimate. Connects you to eternity. Why? It's like a child asking the father why. And if you get into the why, the child keeps asking why. You can't answer the child. Child doesn't have a capacity to appreciate what you have to, even if you do answer him. And if you do answer him and try to explain to him on your level, then you're wasting your time. And you're giving the child an understanding that it's not he has to accept at this age, but he has to understand. If he doesn't understand, he doesn't follow. It's bringing up the child wrongly. Years ago, if you raise a child, even today, properly, with Jewish beliefs, you have a 5-year-old child says, do you believe in God? Yes. Why? Because my father taught me that there's a God. And that's the right answer. At this age, the child doesn't have a capacity to respond. So they'll say, but why do you believe your father? Because he's my father. That's the answer. Because he's my father. And that's where it begins, and that's where it should end. As we advance and we become more learned intellectually, we have a greater capacity, we can start speaking and explaining why. But to a certain point, the why is there's no question why. It is because that's the way it is. So there's certain things, it is the way it is because that's the way God said it is. Because we heard it straight from the Creator himself. And there's no questions, it was the Creator. God himself, when he prophesied, he communicated with us. And we're not talking about future. We're talking about the reality of what is. And if he's the Creator, and he said, this is the way you must live your life, because that's the only way you could advance your soul and you could be part of eternity, which is having a relationship with me, which is the ultimate, which they understood what that meant. There are no questions. There's a famous story. We'll end with this. Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who was the closest student of the Vilna Gaon, he had a certain very close student who was deathly ill. And he says to a student, when you pass away, and there was certain, and he was very special, and he was very ill, had tremendous sufferings in his life. When you come back, when you pass away, I want you to come back and give me the answers that God gave you to explain to you why you had to experience what you experienced. I want you to present those questions and come back to me. 3 days pass, he comes back, and he says to Rav Chaim Volozhiner, asks him the dream. So what did God say? He says, I never asked the questions. Because when I arrived, there were no questions. There were no questions. You understand? When you come before God and you have a level of understanding as a spiritual being, everything is clear beyond, we don't even know what the word clear means. We don't even know what the word cogent means. We don't understand what the word compelling means. It's a level of clarity and reality that you have to be a spiritual being to be able to appreciate what that is. The only reason why we have no understanding is because we're entombed in physicality, which denies us certain abilities to process certain truths. But who gives us that key to truth? It's the prophet. Through the prophet, who God communicates to mankind, that's how we have relevance to truth. And nobody said you should be a fool and accept anybody as a prophet. As I said, the prophet has to meet certain criteria to present a certain level of credential to give him the credibility that he's a prophet. Otherwise, his words fall on deaf ears. Today, we have no prophecy. So what is the prophecy that speaks to us? We're going to speak at this at length. We have written and oral law. That's the prophecy. That's how God speaks to us. God speaks to us through the Torah, the written and the oral law. Could you do it on your own? You have teachers. They have people who are the carriers, the transmitters of the tradition. This is known as the Masorah. Only through them could you have an understanding of what that is. Otherwise, it's almost impossible or too difficult to come upon the truth on your own. We shall continue. 1 second. Well, okay.
Well, me too.
And that was very comforting for you to say that there's a long distance between the brain and the heart, because I
Yes.
struggle with that also. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank
Be
you.
well.
Comforting.